Hello and welcome to another Wagon Wheel with Jarrod Kimber on Spotify Green Room. Remember, you can join these if I actually tell you in advance. But the best way of joining them, of course, is just by subscribing to us on Spotify Green Room, and then you should get a notification. So just my name, and they come up. We currently are doing them on Thursdays because my producer Nick plays cricket on Saturdays, so we had to move it a day earlier. It used to be on Fridays, so I don't know. There's a bit of information you didn't really need, but you have anyway. Thanks to our sponsors, Manscaped. Remember, if you want to shave your testicles in the best way that your testicles have ever been shaved, use the what's it called? Lawnmower 4.0. I've used a lot of lawnmowers in my time. This one is certainly the one I think would be the safest with your testicles. You can use the code REDINKA, all one word, and you can get a 20% discount off on the product. And you also get free worldwide shipping, which is, I don't know, pretty good since most of you are probably spread out into random parts of the world. Also, big thanks to Bodyline T-shirts for their T-shirts and everyone who supports us on Buy Me a Coffee. And obviously the people on Patreon. So huge thanks to everyone who's helped out there. For the people on Patreon, your certain tier statuses allow you to ask questions first on this particular chat, and people have done that. So we'll start with, where are we? Christopher. He's asking about Temba Bavuma's innings from the match the other day and whether coaches and analysts will look at it properly and be critical because he made 100, or they'll pass it off as just an issue. Yeah, I think there's still a big part of that. It's a really tricky conversation. I've found that there are certainly coaches who are willing to admit that there are problems there in a situation like that. I actually also think that Bavuma is probably his best format is one-day cricket because it allows him to bat like that. And obviously he doesn't quite have the turbo button of other players, but I think he's a bit limited for Test cricket, and I'm not sure he has the explosiveness needed for T20 cricket, whereas one-day cricket's almost perfect for him. And having him in the ring for 50 overs is also a huge, huge advantage. So I think there should be more negative talking about making big runs in limited overs cricket in this situation. But the reason it's tricky is, as I think you wrote this question before the game was finished, they won the game, right? And there will be, I think you have to look at it over a long period. I think if you're a coach or an analyst and you go from one particular game, that would be wrong. It's very rare that you should ever look at one game when you're trying to have a look at these sorts of things. Roger says, some English pundits are calling for Stokes to be made captain of the Test team. How sensible is that? Obviously, he's had physical and mental health issues, as you suggest, Roger. Yeah, I don't know what people think Stokes is going to do, Someone on YouTube today said that they think arguably Dawid Malan is England's second best batter. Well, I mean, he's averaging 27, right? In Test cricket so far. He's had a couple of bites of the cherry at this so far. He had a good Ashes, I would say, as far as England batters go, and I think he ended up averaging 24. And as I've said before, what would he have averaged if the series had gone for another 5 tests? I think he would struggle to have averaged much more than 15 or 20. So what is Stokes going to do to fix that? The bowling problems. What is Stokes going to do to suddenly get Wokes to take wickets away from home? I think a lot of nonsense is said about captaincy, right? And England have obviously lost. The bigger problems are structural. The bigger problems are probably not even anything that Ashley Giles or maybe Ashley Giles, but certainly Silverwood or Root are going to have a lot to do. And a lot of it's to do with a generational thing. They just haven't been producing red ball batters for quite some time now. You've got to be honest with that at a certain point. Richard says, you're made England's director of cricket against my will, I'm assuming, Richard. What's the first 3 things you do to make the Test team at least appear competitive? Look, Richard, I'll be honest, I don't think there's anything I could do that would make them competitive straight away. I think they'll still be okay at home. I think they'll occasionally win some tournament series away from home. But I don't think there's any magic thing. I suppose what I would try and do if I was a Supremo would be to have, and I've talked about this on a Red Inca podcast that'll be up next week with Dan Weston. I really do think it's time for 3 divisions of county cricket, but also having more teams. So bring in an extra 2 or 3 teams. I think they might have to look at their pitches and how they can make them more like test pitches and more specifically like pitches overseas. Is there a pitch they can make into a spinning track, for instance? Is there a pitch that they, or a couple of pitches that they can make into spinning tracks and a couple of pitches they can make into overseas? If I was just like Supremo and like I had, unlimited budget, if let's say there's 16 county games a year, I'd be looking at then having 16 county games a year, and 10 of those would be in England, 3 of those would be in South Africa or Australia or somewhere like that, and 3 of those would be in UAE or Sri Lanka or somewhere like that. That would be certainly a couple of things I'd be looking at. But realistically, I'd be trying to work out if there was a way I could get more people from diverse backgrounds to play cricket at the lower level. So there was a higher talent pool to pick from the start. I'd be looking to see if there was ways to make cricket cheaper for people who are not from particularly wealthy backgrounds. And then I suppose the other thing is something around fixing the pitches would be my other major one. Off the top of my head, anyway. Ian Price says, with the women's Ashes just starting up, what would constitute success in terms of coverage, attendance, etc. in Australia? The 100 felt like a watershed for women's cricket outside of the World Cups in England last year. How much traction will this series get in Australia? It's kind of at the end of the interesting part of the Australian summer. Also, I know this isn't a big deal, but they did change the dates, didn't they? I think that might affect attendance. I don't know what they're expecting realistically, in a COVID situation. It's going directly up against the tennis when it comes to ratings at the moment, which is obviously always a bit of a tricky one, with the Melbourne Open being played. But yes, as a general rule, I think, they'd be looking at decent TV numbers and probably enough people that it sounds like a crowd. I think that's the most important thing, especially for when you're covering it on TV or even radio or streaming, wherever. It's important to make people sound like a crowd. I saw about 10 overs of the first T20 at Adelaide. It didn't look like a particularly good crowd to me, but to be honest, I wasn't really focusing on that. But yeah, it's a good question, Ian, but I don't really know what their ideal is. The 100 and the World Cup were the last two things where they really put a lot of money and time into promoting them. I don't think they've quite done that with the Ashes. Plus, as I said, they changed the dates, so it's not ideal. Sandeep says, how well do you think the current Australian batting lineup will perform overseas, considering most of the runs in the Ashes came from Head, Khawaja and Green? I don't think Green, he averaged about 30, didn't he? So, Head overseas, I'm almost interested in Head overseas long term to see how that will play out. I think Head and Khawaja, if they can get them to average between 35 and 40 in this particular, and people continue to struggle with the bat, that means you're probably looking at them averaging 30 to 35 away from home. I think considering everything, Australia would probably take that as a win at the moment. Green, we just don't know. Obviously, it'd be really interesting to see how he plays spinners in Asia, and then eventually the moving ball in England, that big front step of his, and how often his pad gets targeted. I mean, England didn't even have to target his pad that much. In fact, it's possible he's even fixed that problem, but brought about this other problem with the off stump. But yeah, I think, this wasn't particularly challenging. England, didn't challenge Australia the way they should have. Khawaja and Head, I think, got away with it. That's not to say they won't continue to make runs at home, because I think they both can. But what will happen overseas is really interesting. I don't think I have a great answer for you there, Sandeep, but I'm as interested as you are to see how that will all go. Simon says, which batters played the Wobble Ball seam well, do you think? Is this new delivery a reason that batters have taken an off-stump guard? Which players play the Wobble Ball? I would say, no one plays it well. I want to say Root, but I suppose when Cummins is bowling it, you would say probably doesn't play it as well. Williamson's made a lot of runs. I do think, all things being considered, the New Zealand pitches have been a little bit easier. Dean Elgar seems to be the one who's done the best of recent times against the seamers in Test match cricket without assistance from his pitch. The New Zealanders and the Sri Lankans both have a little bit more assistance with their batting pitches than Dean Elgar has. But having said that, Dean Elgar's always been a fantastic batter on dodgy South African pitches. So if I was gonna guess, I reckon I would put my money on Latham, Williamson, and Elgar as being the guys who've handled the wobble ball the best. But that's more looking at the numbers. That's not on the eye test. Is the new delivery a reason why batters are taking off stump guard? No, I think that's more to do with Steve Smith batting on off stump and outside of off stump. Also, some of the Asian batters obviously have done it before as well, or batted around off stump or shuffled across. But I would think of that as more a general move rather than for the wobble ball directly. Although getting outside off stump against the wobble ball can be advantageous if the ball does seam back, which is what most wobble balls either go straight or seam back, right? So that could be a reason, but I think it's probably part of the overarching Smith kind of narrative. The only thing I would say with the wobble ball is that you probably would rather, especially in first class cricket, probably would rather getting hit on the pads than you would batting on leg stump. So there might be a part of that, Simon. You might be right, and it might also be why we saw the batting techniques change in England first, outside of Smith, obviously, and Labuschagne, and a couple of those Asian players. But I think the reason we saw it change in England first is because that's also where the wobble ball first took off. Even if it was Muhammad Asif, it was really county cricket where it was most effective. Kumar says, with the ODI World Cup next year, it's interesting that the schedule has less limited over games happening, with series having 5 games cut down to 3 since the last World Cup. Do you think this might have an adverse impact on the teams and their preparation? And is the pandemic also in it? Yeah, I mean, that pandemic's probably going to have the most to say with that. It's just hard to fit things in. Australia, New Zealand, they had one day as I think scheduled, didn't they, Kumar? And they had to be cancelled. That, I mean, as much as it's just Australia, big dicking a small team again, I think that's also directly related to I think that's also directly related to the pandemic and the way that things are going. I think in a perfect world, Australia would probably rather play those one-dayers. What you might see is a few series now cancel, Kumar, but then about very similar to what happened with the T20 World Cup at the last minute, everyone will be playing everyone again. I think not preparing for one-day cricket. I don't think many teams outside of probably that sort of associate level team, and I don't mean associate, but I mean Afghanistan, Ireland, who play a lot of associates, are probably really regularly preparing for one-day cricket. I think a lot of the other teams sort of come and go with it. So, yeah, it could be a little bit like that T20 World Cup where we could have another random winner that we didn't really see coming in. Neil says, just finished off Series 3 of Double Century. So for those who don't know, Double Century is my podcast on the history of cricket. We've done 3 series of that so far. Just wondering if you think that Afghanistan have the best origin story into international cricket. Yeah, I think they probably do. I remember, and I've written this a few times, like if you look at Afghanistan, it's an absolute gift to cricket. They don't really exist in any other major sports. They obviously play some of their own domestic sports, but they're phenomenal as a story for what they bring to cricket. The fact they've come from outside the Commonwealth, the fact that it happened so quickly, the story of the refugees, all those things that happened to Afghanistan, I think is probably the best origin story in cricket. West Indies is quite interesting. Even Ireland is quite interesting. This country that played cricket for years and didn't go anywhere with it. I'm trying to think of who else. I think some of the other teams were probably a little bit late, weren't they? But West Indies, I think, was quite an interesting one as well. Might have been better if, obviously, they didn't have white captains at the start. But as a general rule, I thought the West Indies one was also a really, really interesting story at the start of Test cricket. AB says, which international series are you most looking forward to over the coming months? Going to next year's World Cup, which teams do you think are the most underrated? What am I looking forward to? Well, I'm working on the England-West Indies series. I don't know if looking forward to... England-West Indies? Yeah, West Indies, England's tour of West Indies. That's what I'm working on next. The Women's World Cup, I would, really like to spend a lot more time on, but obviously the time zone's not perfect from where I am, and I will be working on other cricket at the same time. with the mega auction coming up, I think in some ways the two most interesting seasons in the IPL are probably the first season after the mega auction and then your last season before the next one. Just because of the way the cycles work and the way that teams think, we get to see new teams. So I think the IPL is quite exciting. I'm trying to think what else. What have I got on my board here? But yeah, I think those are probably the major sorts of things. Always at this time of the year, I'm always thinking I'll be able to cover a PSL, and then I usually get work and don't get to cover it. I think that's going to happen again this year. But yeah, the Women's World Cup is certainly, I think, the thing that we should be most excited about. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else coming up. I'm not particularly good at looking forward, AB. That's why I have a calendar right behind the camera, and I actually haven't updated it. So it's only got, I think it's got West Indies, England as the last game on my calendar, and maybe the IPL just starting after that. So those are the next two that are really in the forefront of my mind at the moment. India travel to West Indies, don't they? I'm trying to think. Australia-Pakistan's going to be really interesting as well. Yeah, I think there's some good cricket coming up, but yeah, I'm terrible at that sort of thing. Sorry. James says, Colley's outburst. Oh, wait, did I miss a question then? No. James says, Colley's outburst has made me wonder who's the first player to deliberately use a stump mic as a communication channel. Ian Healy, I think, is probably the pioneer of this. He used to order Big Mac and chips, didn't he? He knew the woman who was the, I don't know, would you call her an edit, a sound mixer? I don't even know what her job was. Censor, probably. So yeah, I think Ian Healy did that. I think that was you mentioned there, James, that a 12 someone might have used it to try and get somebody for the 12th man. I think that did happen as well. I'm not sure if that was Healy, but I think it might have been. The big story, and I don't know how much this is true, so I won't use the names, but the big story was one particular player was sledging a lot on a tour, and a batter turned to the stumps and said quite loudly, would you like me to say into the stump mic that you've been cheating on your wife while you're on this tour? That's the best one I've heard. But yeah, obviously I think Tim Payne used it realistically one way or another, didn't he? Probably probably ended up with a radio show in Hobart. Did Tim Payne. So I think that's probably one that certainly happened. Surf says, with Nivathan Radhakrishnan, sorry if I mispronounced that. It's the first time I've had to say it out loud. He's playing for the under-19 team and bowling ambidextrously. Figures in the first game were good, second game not so good, and didn't play in the third game. Will he become the first mainstream ambidextrous bowler? Well, no, Surf, because we already had one. Sri Lanka had one years ago, and I always forget his name, but I was there in 2018 when he played. So no, we've already had that. The problem with the ambidextrous bowlers is the chances are of you finding someone who's talented enough to bowl with one arm who can also do a handy job with the other arm is quite slim. I think the best way for it to happen would be, my guess would be someone who is properly ambidextrous to begin with. I would assume, the guys that we've seen that have tried it so far are. You'd have to be properly ambidextrous. I would then think that your main skill would have to be left arm finger spin. And the reason I would say that is because you're going up against right-handers, and left-handers are poorer against off-spin than right-handers are against left arm finger spin. So you would have to be dominant with that left arm finger spin against right-handers, otherwise it wouldn't work. And then your off-spin really only needs to be just above or around part-time level. Would be my way of looking at that. So I don't think it's going to be very common, but I also don't think it's impossible. As you say, it opens up tactical benefits. I think it helps you at team selection at times. I just can't see that many players being that good at it. But, we have seen players like Garfield Sobers, and we've seen guys who can bowl off spin and leg spin. And we've seen guys like Ollie Robinson and Colin Miller and Tony Gregg all be able to bowl seam up and spin. It's certainly a possibility that we will see combination bowlers coming forward. Whether we will see purely ambidextrous ones or not, I don't know. But we will see more people who bowl leg spin to right-handers and off spin to left-handers as a general rule. I'd be shocked if then we don't also get some of these ambidextrous people coming through. Thanks everyone for their questions. Let me see who's got their hand up in the chat. Jimmy, you there?
Hi, Jarrod. Am I audible?
Hi, what's your question?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about the rule that I introduced regarding the over rates in T20s. What's the new in that?
So you're talking about the fielding, them changing the field. Is that right?
No, that if we are not on time, then additional fader we have to bring inside 30 yards.
Yeah.
They did that in 100 as well.
Yeah. Here's my biggest problem with it. Here's my biggest problem with it, Jimmy, is that essentially what happens is we are still blaming the fielding side for slow over rates, and I don't necessarily believe it's the fielding side that is purely to blame for that. I think those days are gone. I think those days left when people were changing gloves every 10 seconds. When we were with Scotland, we had from what I remember in that World Cup qualifiers, a lot of the teams had really good over rates. And the reason they had really good over rates is the umpires stopped the batters being able to have a break for drinks every 2 seconds and be able to change their gloves every 2 seconds. And, all this sort of nonsense is also what slows the game down. And I honestly, I have real trouble with that. That said, it is very easy to bowl 20 overs in your allotted time, and teams should be doing it. And we have allowed bowling teams for almost 40, 50 years now to get away with this. And if this is something that helps, put it this way, I'm not a huge fan, Jimmy, of the free hit. Like, as a general rule, I think it's a silly way of doing it. But also know that it basically stopped no balls in limited overs cricket. And if that's the case, then it worked. And if this does the same thing, that's fine. But what I would be telling my batters is, slow down as much as possible during the innings, right? Come up with every single, undo your shoelace and redo your shoelace and.
Yeah. But ideally, T20
Yeah, what I'm saying is
get over way before 3 hours. 3 hours, but you were dragging it to 3.5 hours. IPL game got 4 hours. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, how are you going to compete with other teams?
They get 4.5. That's what I mean. Well, I don't think that matters. I mean, basketball games, sometimes go for a long time. NFL games go for a long time. I'm not necessarily worried about that. What I'm worried about,
you can't waste time like that. I mean, if you want to get cricket in the Olympics, can't waste time like that.
Well, cricket is going to be in the Olympics, and we already waste time. So I don't think those two things are linked at all. So what I would say, Jimmy.
Jarrod.
Jarrod,
did you?
I did, but no one is not going to take.
No, did you read that cricket is not in the initial list? Is, I mean, initial list cricket is for 2028.
Yeah, but cricket's going to be in the Olympics one way or another, Jimmy. Yeah, but cricket's going to be in the Olympics one way or the other. And the reason is because the Olympics want to make more money from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Right? So cricket's going to be in the Olympics one way or another, Jimmy. Right? And no one at the Olympic Committee is going to not take cricket because of a time limit problem. Right? They'll just work out a way around that. So that you don't have to worry about things like that when it comes to the Olympics. Cricket will eventually make it to the Olympics, whenever that may be. But as far as this particular thing, I think it's too easy to game. But so that's my biggest problem with it, is that the batting team can actually have play a huge part in it. And so that's where I worry about it. Anyway, mate. For some reason you're not coming up in my list. I'm not worried. I mean, we're not talking about junior level anyway at the moment, Jimmy. If you could just remove yourself. For some reason, you're not coming up.
Yeah, sure.
I need to get to the next question, Jimmy, but thank you. Dhruv, are you there? Dhruv?
Yeah, hello?
You there? Yeah, what's your question?
Yeah, so in the third or second test against South Africa, India had a review for caught behind, but the decision wasn't overturned because they couldn't be on ultra edge if there was an actual edge. So why don't they use hotspot?
Sorry, you're asking about ultra edge and hotspot? Sorry, there's so much noise in the background, Dhruv. Sorry, Dhruv, there's so much noise in the background, mate. I don't. I mean, you're asking about a specific dismissal. I don't remember it off the top of my head.
Their bats are closer to the ground.
Yeah, but my point is, I didn't see that dismissal. I don't know if there was a good angle of hotspot. I don't know if hotspot was working at that time, which is sadly a thing that happens quite a lot. So I can't answer that question because I didn't see it. Sorry about that.
Yeah. I
Cheers,
would
mate.
just
Bye. Okay. Can you just go to a more quiet place? Because it's really loud where you are, Dhruv.
Yeah. So in the you were in your video about Tim Payne, you said that a lot of keepers are worse keepers and better batsmen than they used to be before. So should keepers, should young keepers focus more on their batting than their keeping?
So what do you mean? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused there.
So you said that Tim Payne was a decent keeper, but a much better batsman. And a lot of keepers nowadays aren't too good at keeping, but they're really good at batting.
Yeah.
So should a young keeper focus more on his batting than his keeping?
Doesn't matter because they don't pick young keepers. They pick batters in representative sides and then they give them the gloves when they get there. That's the problem. It isn't that young keepers aren't working on their batting. It's that if you're a keeper and you're not in the best 5 or 10 batters to begin with, you're not even going to be going to that next level of cricket. We've basically eradicated specialist wicket keepers or even wicket-keeping dominant players. So the only way that you would be able to be playing international cricket now would be if you're like a freak all-rounder who happens to be a great wicketkeeper and a great batter. The only place where that is slightly less of a problem is Asia, because teams still have to have a very good wicketkeeper because, it might be up at the stumps 80% of the time in some test matches. But outside of Asia specifically, but basically you pick squads and then you give the gloves to someone when they're there. So that's why we don't end up with the best wicket keepers, because we're selecting them out well before they even get to professional level.
So would you say someone like Glenn Phillips is more suited to becoming a better, more chance of playing international cricket because he also bowls?
Oh, well, I mean, as a general rule, if you can bat and bowl and wicket keep, you're more used in T20 franchises and perhaps your international team. I mean, that would be the case with anyone, wouldn't it? That's like asking if someone's a great fielder, if that's handy. Like, all those things are handy. Glenn Phillips can go on any squad with New Zealand as a backup because he can wicket keep. But Glenn Phillips works very diligently on his wicket keeping. But again, I wouldn't call him a natural wicketkeeper or a quality wicketkeeper. He's just someone who can do the job. And you see that with Nicholas Pooran, and you see that, Joss Butler and right across the game. Thanks for your question, mate. If you could just remove yourself, because for some reason, those options aren't coming up to me today. Johan, are you there? Johan.
Hey, Jarrod.
Yeah, Johan? Yeah, what's your question?
Yeah, so I think you had spoken a lot about the batsmen that come into international cricket and then have a higher average in international cricket than their domestic, right? And you had given reasons for that. So I just went and searched through the list of some bowlers like randomly, and it seems like it's very, very rare that a bowler has a lower average in international cricket than in first class cricket. Do you know what that's the case? I think only Shane Warne had like a considerable difference.
Well, I mean, the case is that, well, the case is quite simple. If you're trying to make a pitch that lasts 4 days and you're trying to make a pitch that lasts 5 days, what's the one variable there? The pitch has to be flatter for the 5-day pitch, doesn't it? Right? And not all first-class cricket has even always been 4 days. Sometimes it's been 3 days as well. Again, you have to make it more in favor of the bowlers. So the pitches in first-class cricket across the board usually favour bowlers more. Not to mention that in first-class cricket, you're much more like we whinge about pitches being doctored in Test cricket. Oh my God! Have a look at T20 cricket or first-class cricket. That's where the real doctoring goes on. That's where pitches are absolutely brutal. I heard a great story from a county cricketer a few months back who was telling me that there was a particular player that they were like, you can't even take their home record seriously because the pitches that they play on at home are so incredibly doctored towards this one particular player. So, yeah, that's the main reason. A 5-day pitch has to be better for batting. It has to last, right? It has to be built more solid to last. And 3 and 4 day pitches usually have a little bit more spice in them and usually more dominant for bowlers. So that is the main reason. What is the other reason is probably, as a general rule, bowlers don't go back and have long careers after they finish Test cricket because their bodies are stuffed. Whereas you do sometimes get Test players to go back and they will play a little bit of first-class cricket after they retire. It doesn't happen in all countries, but certainly happens probably more for batters than it does bowlers. Certainly in English cricket, where the bulk of first-class cricket was played up until 1980s probably. In that particular situation, players certainly went back there and did it again. So I would say that is maybe the most obvious reason for that to happen. Also, the only other thing I would say is that we pick batters based on records more, and we pick bowlers on potential more. So my guess is there's probably more sort of failed Test bowlers because you're trying to pick a bowler really when they're ready to take Test wickets. Quite often with batters, you're picking them when they have made consistent runs, which is a slightly different thing. If you think about spinners and especially spinners with balls that can't be picked or extreme fast bowlers, they're probably picked on a whim when they're ready, for a certain kind of pitch or team, and so they probably are not particularly. They've probably just in the last little while done a lot, and then they've come into Test cricket and struggle on the wickets that are not particularly suited for them. But that's just, these are all small reasons. But the biggest reason is that 5-day pitches are better for batting than 4-day or 3-day pitches. Cheers, mate. If you could just remove yourself, that'd be great. Yeah, go.
Okay, I just wanted to know why 8 wickets are counted against the bowler's wickets. Seems very weird.
Well, basically, because I think handle the ball should be against on the bowler's wicket as well. The majority of hit wickets have something to do with the bowler, right? They've pushed you back in the crease. They've made you play that shot. You are in a different position in the crease because of the bowler. Even if you look at the ones where the foot slips at the back, well, why is that batter so far back in the crease? Was it a short ball? Was it a series of short balls? Were they having trouble with a ball on a particular length from a spinner? Whatever that may be, I think the bowler plays a huge role in that. And the same with handle the ball. The majority of handle the balls come when the ball has been, the batter has hit the ball into the ground and it's either spun or it's bounced or it's hit the pad and it's trickling back towards the stumps. Well, the bowler did that, right? That didn't happen by accident. There's no more fluke in a hit wicket from a bowler than there is from a perfectly timed drive that just happens to be at a catchable height and go straight to a fielder. Like, there's plenty of wickets that we count to bowlers that they didn't, they might not have earned. So I don't really understand why we wouldn't let them earn a hit wicket or a handle the ball. But apparently we do with one and we don't with the other. So, do with that what you may. Thanks for your question. No worries. If you could remove yourself. Connor says, what is your opinion on the Mark Boucher situation? So, this is sort of unraveling as we go to air. So my understanding is that he's been suspended from the coaching position based on what happened at the social justice hearings. I don't know how official that is, but that's what I've seen reported. What is it? Just after midday on Thursday, UK time. I find it very weird that they didn't suspend him instantly when those reports came about, and have a really thorough investigation into Mark Boucher. My guess is, from what I have known from other international players that I've chatted to about Mark Boucher, that there's a lot more stories out there about Mark Boucher doing and saying things that really make his job untenable. I haven't heard the same for Graham Smith, so I don't know what the situation would be with Graham Smith. But yeah, for Mark Boucher, I've certainly heard things from players that, I think should have meant that, she shouldn't have got the job in the first place, but now that they're looking into these things correctly, I would think that he would lose his job. That said, I don't know about the SJN stuff. Obviously, I saw the same reports that everyone else did. But I find it very hard to think that Mark Boucher is the coach for the South African cricket team and everything it wants to represent and everything it should represent. He's not the only coach in the world that probably shouldn't be in his position. Obviously, Darren Lehman was still coaching up with that team up north, Northern Rhinos or whatever they're called. No, it's Leeds Rhinos, isn't it? Northern I forget the name of their team. The Northern 100 team. It's probably on my desk somewhere. I think there's, in certain situations, I'm not sure we should ever forgive those sorts of things, but there are certain situations that we should and we shouldn't. But I think regardless of that, there should have been a full thing, which would have been fairer to Boucher as well. I think allowing him to coach with this weird sort of, cloud over his head. But I think if they do a full evaluation of Mark Boucher, I just don't think he's going to remain as the coach of the South African cricket team going forward, if we're being honest. But very early on in that, and I haven't seen all the evidence, and I think it'd be great to hear more from Mark Boucher directly as well. But I don't think that's a partnership that's going to stay, would be my guess, Connor. All right. Keshav, what's your question?
Hi, Jarrod.
Hi, what's your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, that's why I said, what's your question?
Sorry, you cut out in between. Sorry. So
That's all right.
I actually happened to hear your podcast on Shane Warne. So I picked out something interesting there. So how he inspired you to take up leg spin one way or the other, and how.
No. I have to stop you there. He did not inspire me to take up leg spin. I took up leg spin 2 years before Shane Warne was a thing. I had no idea Shane Warne even existed as a human being when I started bowling leg spin.
I mean, he further probably he drove you to keep getting better at it, at least.
No, not really. I just liked it. I loved it as an art form. I suppose what I learned from Warne was, little things, going forward. But no, certainly, I mean, he was a hero because he was a great player. But I never thought I'm going to be like Warne or I'm bowling leg spin because Warne bowls leg spin. I would have bowled leg spin my whole life, even if Shane Warne never existed.
Okay, so actually my question is, how we see in India, people are so much inspired by the greatest of superstars in Sachin Tendulkar or Virat Kohli. So that way we have had a lot of batsmen. So India is known to be a batsman country. Same way if you go to Pakistan, so people getting inspired from Wasim and Waqar. So a lot of fast bowls coming from there. So if Shane Warne is probably the greatest cricketer, one of the greatest cricketers, or the best bowler to play from Australia, so why wasn't he able to inspire a generation of leg spinners coming through? I mean,
I've got one. That's an easy one for you if you want. There's two easy things here. A, why weren't there a bunch of great all-rounders after Kapil Dev in India?
okay.
Right? So, I mean, you are cherry picking here. India was a nation of very good batting, and a lot of very good batters came after a generation of a lot of very good batters, to be fair, in the 70s and 80s as well. Then in the 90s and 2000s, they had a lot of good batters. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, they've had a lot of good batters, right? They've only had one Kapil Dev. Kapil Dev was one of the most inspirational figures in Indian history. Maybe not quite at the level of Sachin Tendulkar, but certainly probably at the level of Gavaskar. And in some ways was more inspiring because of his backstory than other people, right? And there aren't a lot of Kapil Devs out there, right? Wasim Akram is probably slightly different in Pakistan only because I think Wasim Akram opened up the idea in professional cricket, if nothing else, that a left-arm bowler is so valuable. And Wasim Akram happened to be a genius left-arm bowler, so he's a huge advantage there. And I don't think Wasim Akram just changed Pakistani cricket, right? I mean, we now have more left-arm bowlers everywhere in the world since Wasim Akram happened. So I think that's something he changed in cricket worldwide. And they also had in Pakistan Inzaman al-Haq and Shahid Afridi. And you could put Yunus Khan in that as well, right? They've had a lot of inspirational cricketers. In fact, Imran Khan's probably more inspirational than any of those. They haven't had another great all-rounder either, right? There's a reason you can't replicate Kapil Dev. There's a reason you can't replicate Imran Khan or Shane Warne. Tons of leg spinners came through after Shane Warne in Australia. The amount of leg spin bowled in Australia after Shane Warne and before Shane Warne is markedly different. Right, it went up probably double to triple the amount of leg spin that was bowled right across the cricket. But Shane Warne is a freak physical specimen. I mean, I know we look at him and we see him as, a little bit chubby at times and, a little bit, but the arm strength and the hand strength and the shoulder strength that Shane Warne had, all the kids that came up behind him in my era were tiny little skinny kids, most of which who could bat, right? And they started bowling leg spin as a hobby. If you can find me another leg spinner since Shane Warne in any country in the world that has the same physicality of Shane Warne, I've never seen one. I've never seen anyone as physically strong as Shane Warne come through and be consistent. That's the bit that you would need to mimic to be as good as Shane Warne. So you can have more leg spinners, but it also matters what. And then if you're trying to get all these young kids and coach them up to be the next Shane Warne and copy his physicality at the crease, you're not going to be able to do that because they're not built like Shane Warne. They don't have Shane Warne's strengths. I think that was a big part of it. But just as a general rule, that I don't think I think you're trying to simplify these things, right? India is a nation of great batting, right? Australia is a nation of great big fast bowlers as a general rule, right? Those sorts of things are going to keep coming out of those two different countries, right? Bangladesh, for whatever reason, is a nation of left-arm finger spinners. Shakib Al Hasan didn't inspire all these other left-arm finger spinners that have come before since him. He was just one of them, right? And sometimes you have a freak athlete and sometimes you have something else. So we shouldn't get confused with, this person inspired blah. I mean, Ian Botham, there were all-rounders before Ian Botham. Tony Greig was a really good all-rounder for England. Not to mention, going back in generations, they have lots of all-rounders. But then they had a freak all-rounder. And then what England tried to do is think that they could just manufacture another Ian Botham, right? And no one inspired a cricket nation more than Ian Botham, right? And yet they couldn't. And it really took until that, 20 odd years later to have someone of that level. It's not that Ian Botham isn't inspiring. It's just what Ian Botham does is almost impossible to replicate for a normal human mammal, right? So that's the problem with Shane Warne, and that's the problem with Kapil Dev, and that's the problem with these sorts of players. For all the talk about how Adam Gilchrist changed wicketkeeping, we actually, when you look at the numbers, wicketkeeping was changing before Adam Gilchrist and continued to change after him. And as inspiring as Adam Gilchrist have I missed all the other wicketkeepers averaging around 50 with a strike rate of 80? Do you know what I mean? Like at a certain point, it's not about inspiring people. It's like you inspire someone and then they go on to be the kind of cricketer that their body and skill set probably matches. And in Shane Warne's case, trying to imitate Shane Warne's action would be, I can promise you this, it's virtually impossible unless you have his physical attributes to go with it. And I don't remember that many broad-shouldered leg spinners coming through. Shane Warne probably should have been a quick bowler, right? He probably had the upper body strength, more so of a quick bowler, but had the ability to rip a ball sideways and built a career off that. So, yeah, I think that's the best way of doing it. But the whole inspiring thing, it works if it works to get more people playing cricket. But there are so many people who grew up wanting to be Shane Warne that probably now are batters and fast bowlers, right? And wicket keepers. or off spinners. Like, they still are inspired by Shane Warne, and Shane Warne helped them play cricket. And the same will happen for Virat Kohli and Sachin Tendulkar, and probably happen for Kapil Dev, right? Like, a load of kids from the sticks probably went, wait a minute, if he can go on to play for India, maybe we can as well. But then that doesn't mean that they're outswinger bowlers who can tonk sixes. You know, maybe they're left arm seamers or finger spinners or whatever. So Wasim Akram, I think, is a separate case. In many different ways. But as a general rule, I really don't believe, and I should say this about Wasim Akram, I think cricket was already starting to work out that left-arm bowlers were undervalued in the game. I think even before Wasim Akram, we saw Bruce Reed make a big impact there. So I do think teams are starting to work it out, but Wasim Akram was certainly the poster boy for it. I think he had a bigger influence on left-arm bowlers than Adam Gilchrist had on wicket keepers. But thanks for your question, mate.
Yeah, I mean, can I ask one more?
Yeah, if it's quick.
Yeah. Just a quick observation I made. So during the India-South Africa series, I heard the commentators calling somebody like an Ashwin or a Bumrah, quote unquote, thinking cricketers. So I felt, why would they specify somebody as a thinking cricketer? Does that mean the other people are non-thinking? Because these two people have, got some fancy degrees, and they're really highly educated. But when they were talking about somebody like Umesh Yadav, who will bowl a couple of loose deliveries every over, so do you think that thinking cricketer comes from the level of literacy a person has?
No, because Shane Warne was a thinking cricketer, and Shane Warne's thick as two shits, isn't he? All right, a thinking cricketer is the ability really to. There's a huge amount of professional cricketers who are there because they have a particular physical attribute or particular technical aspect of their game that is better than everyone else in the world. Right, so my favorite one is Rahat Ali, right? He's an 85 mile an hour left arm seam bowler. Doesn't matter that he wasn't particularly skillful, because he was a left arm bowler and he bowled at 85 miles an hour and could get up to probably 90 miles an hour. There aren't that many of those in the world, so he made it to Test cricket. Can he bowl an in-swinger or an outswinger? No. Can he bowl a particularly good slow ball? Not from what I've seen. Can he bat? I mean, quite clearly not, right? So a thinking cricketer is someone who has the ability to pick up other things, who's picking up other clues, and is probably not just using their natural ability or their technical ability to be good. Now, it's a bit like the heavy ball. I had this argument with Ian O'Brien once on Twitter, and I think we misunderstood each other. I'm not saying the heavy ball doesn't exist. I'm saying most times when a commentator says he bowls a heavy ball, what he's really saying is that guy's bigger than a normal bowler, right? Whereas a heavy ball is a technical skill. It's not a physical skill, right? It's to do with backspin, according to Ian O'Brien, and he reckons he's done the research, so I'll go with him on that one. And yet it's used because the guy's big. Ryan Harris bowls a heavy ball. I'm not saying Ryan Harris doesn't bowl a heavy ball. He may, but it's weird how many guys who are big and bulky seem to bowl a heavy ball, and how many guys who are petite do not seem to bowl a heavy ball. And I think it's a bit the same with the thinking cricketer. I think sometimes it's given to people who are book smart or are known to be quite intelligent on the circuit, whereas realistically a thinking cricketer probably means someone who in the game, Kyron Pollard is a perfect example of that, and Mark Watt, guys who use the crease more than other cricketers. So Mark Wood, now a lot of players use the crease, but Mark Wood was one of the first regular bowlers to use the crease. I would say that is a thinking cricketer. A normal cricketer just gets to the top of their mark, runs in and bowls from their normal spot all the time. Thanks for that. If you could take yourself off. Oh, I've lost this person's name. I'm sorry, whoever you are, I've promoted you, but your name has disappeared and I can't see it.
Hey, Jarrod.
Do you want to? Yeah, I can. Do you want to say your name just because I can't say it?
Yeah, my name is Atharva.
Atharva. Okay, thank you. Sorry, for some reason the people aren't coming up on my app today. So once I clicked yes, I lost you. But Atharva, what is your question?
So my question's about New Zealand cricket. I remember from the podcast you released on Ross Taylor, you talked about how even New Zealand has the problem of cricket not being overly popular there and being kind of constrained to a small population. How is it in a country where cricket is not necessarily as popular as it could be, and when the country already only has like a very small population to begin with, they're able to stay competitive with larger countries. Are they doing something radically different at the administrative level, or have they been lucky with the talent that's come through?
The first thing you need to know is, and I don't know what your ethnic background is, but this is a question I get asked a lot by Asian people. I don't think there's a country outside of Asia where cricket is the major sport, right? So, cricket is nowhere near the major sport, obviously, in England. Cricket's not the major sport in South Africa. Cricket's not the major sport in Australia. Cricket's not the major sport in New Zealand. I don't know about Zimbabwe. Ooh, that's an interesting one. Certainly not the major sport. It's probably not in the 10 or at least not in the 6 major sports of Ireland. So cricket isn't the major sport in a lot of these countries. So I think that is a really important thing to know. I think another thing with New Zealand is that it has a very stable democracy and a very high standard of living. So they don't have some of the issues that some of the other cricket nations do have when it comes to their players. They also have a very good, thriving club cricket scene. That I think there's another advantage of New Zealand cricket, which limits them, but also helps them perform very well in that they can't chop and change their team as much as other teams. So Australia, a player will come in and a player will go out. In South Africa, and a player will come in and a player will go out. In New Zealand, they allow people to learn Test cricket by playing Test cricket because they don't have as many options. That can cause a problem if they have a bunch of those players in their team. But if they have 2 or 3 people coming in and they have a solid core around them, they can actually start to build good units. Having said that, when it drops off really poorly. So the early 90s is a really good podcast I did with Danny Morrison. I don't think people realize how bad New Zealand got in that period. After being probably the 3rd best Test team in the world, they really dropped off. And that's the problem with the small talent pool, is that Australia is probably never going to drop off in the way that New Zealand did, just because there's so many more people playing. Their recent success, and when you talk about them being successful, remember they've only really been massively successful in Test cricket in 2 eras in 80 years. 80 years? 90 years. 90 years. 1930 they came in, didn't they? And they've only ever been successful twice, right? When they do get a good batch of players, though, they have that ability to bring them together. And as I said, they all end up getting a lot more experience. Players don't fear for being dropped as much because they just aren't players to replace them. So they build these little, almost like talent bubbles at times, which you do see in professional sports sometimes can be quite helpful. The other thing that they've done right now is that they fix their pitches. They really understood their talent development. They were probably the first team outside of maybe India and England to really understand, depth charts and what they wanted to do. They coached more as a unit rather than everyone coaching individually. And they've had a very good run, right? I mean, Williamson, Taylor, Bolt, Southey, the fact that all those players crossed over, they were very lucky to get, the very good backups, guys like Wagner, BJ Watling, Devon Conway now, the sort of that De Grandhomme, that sort of South African backup core has been phenomenal as well. Like that's a huge boom in a place like South Africa, and I don't think that should be understated. Because they're not England, we don't make fun of them. But as a general rule, that is just a huge step up, I think, for New Zealand, and it's certainly been helpful. So yes, I think there's a few different things, but I think we have to be realistic. And so they're getting a lot of things right at the moment in a period where a lot of teams are not getting a lot of things right. And this is only their 2nd major era in 90 years. So when we say that they're overperforming, we need to be really realistic with that and be like, they've played a lot of Test cricket and they've been really good at it in 2 different eras. And that's probably more or less what you would expect a team like New Zealand to do if everything else went right for them and that they continue to produce really good players. And I suppose that's the most important thing, that they have continued to produce really good players. Their biggest problem, if you look through the history of cricket, wasn't that they never produced players. It was that they couldn't back them up with a professional system to keep them around. So early days, players would leave for England. Later, players would leave for England again. But also just really good players who got to 28, 29, 30, who became good Test players after years in the system, would retire because there was no money in playing cricket for New Zealand and they would go off and do their day jobs. So they've had lots of problems with that in the history of New Zealand cricket as well. That's no longer a problem because they now have a professional structure. And that professional structure only started in whenever it was Ross Taylor played his first year. Was it 2005 or 2004? Whenever that was. So before then, the amount of players that they were losing in that system was astronomical. And that's no longer happening. And they've done very well to keep them, train them, and develop them ever since. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jarrod.
No worries. Sri Ranjan, are you there? Sri Ranjan?
Hey, Jarrod.
How you doing? What's your question?
Was more of sort of a general sporting question, and then I wanted your take with the cricketing lens on that. So you could sort of say that in general, you have two sort of league format structures in the sporting world. You could sort of broadly categorize as the American and the European structure, where European one, you have the tiered system where you have the threat of sort of relegation and promotion, but also you have sort of more capitalist type of spending where I guess the top teams are always the highest earners and they can spend most money. And then you have sort of the American system where you have the salary caps. You don't have the threat of, say, relegation, but you do have sort of a reward system where you get the draft picks and teams have the race to tank and stuff like that. So with the idea of how, IPL may move away from like the mega auctions and in general, sort of how you think global T20 leagues in cricket would be suited to these, either of these sort of formats, where would you prefer like a relegation promotion threat, or would you like the idea of draft pool and you get to pick if you finish last?
Well, we're not going to have promotion and relegation in cricket because we're not going to have like a franchise in a lower league who's going to be owned by an owner who's going to put a lot of money in to have a better, have a team that's good enough to play against the Mumbai Indians, right? So that is never going to work, that system, which is why my guess is that Lalit Modi and the BCCI at the time and IMG probably decided against it. So the reason that works in European sport is because those teams already exist, right? They're long-running teams, and if you look at the disparity between those, you might have a city in Europe that has a very good team. Once had a very good team and has dropped off, and could be a very good team again. Again, that probably doesn't quite fit the American sports narrative. Or not the narrative, but the history of American sports, because the league was the most important thing, not the team and the city. So what you're really asking is a question of which one works better. Well, the only one that can work in IPL is going to be the league one, because we don't have Bayern Bangalore or I've already run out of football crossovers to do that. But we don't have Kerala United, who's got a huge fan base and a huge following and is about to come in. So it doesn't really work. There isn't a second division or a third division or a fourth division or a fifth division. And that was pretty much similar to the American sports, in that the minor league teams generally went to the small cities, right? And the major league teams went to the big cities. So that was why you have that system in America, and that's why it was used for the IPL, I suppose to a lesser extent, the Big Bash 100 as well, and some of the other tournaments as well. It's because we didn't have that structure beforehand, so I don't think you'd ever do that. Yeah, I think in the IPL specifically at the moment, I think there's I think the seasons aren't long enough to have benefits if you come last. But at a certain point, if you want a fair league, and your team is falling apart, just coming last isn't really helping anyone. You don't want to be in a situation where you have a team. Rajasthan might be a very good example of this, where they just can't get out of their own way, and they keep dragging themselves through the mud. And by coming last, they don't even get the chance of getting the next big talent to come through. So I do think that is certainly a problem. But I also think that the league's just too short to have a tank. The league's too short and too small to have tanking teams. So that would be my worry about giving too much benefits to the team for coming last or second last. But eventually, I would think we will have between 12 and 18 teams over the next 5 to 10 years, and we'll have probably a slightly longer tournament, and we'll have more than one game a day, which is a really important thing. That's another thing. You don't want a tanking team playing if they're the only game on in primetime TV, which is not usually the case in American sports. So yes, I think though that makes a lot more sense, that entire system, than the European system, just because the European system is kind of only works in Europe because of the history of how the sports have grown over there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Is there any tie-in maybe with domestic setups if they have that similar history, do you think? Or is that completely unrelated?
They don't have that similar history. Do you know what I mean? They don't have a T20 team with lots of fans. You could. It really does need a whole structure around it, because who would buy, like, I'm trying to think of a team, who would buy that team and then pump all that money into it when it doesn't have any fans to milk, right? So you're only doing it to get the TV rights package at that point, and then you're just another franchise. So why would you not just wait for the next time for there to be an open franchise rather than pumping money into an already busted system that doesn't have anything? Right? So I don't think it makes any sense. You're much better off to either buy an existing team or wait for a new franchise to come about. Thanks for your question. If you could remove yourself, that would be great.
Thank you.
Jamie, you there?
Hi, Jarrod.
Hi, mate. What's your question?
Really enjoyed your article in your YouTube video on Shane Warne. It was really good. It got me quite emotional. It got me thinking about similar time playing cricket as well as a teenager. So really enjoyed that. The question I want to ask was on the Ashes. If you had a time machine and, armed with the knowledge that we've got now, go back and have a word in Joe Root's ear, what would you tell him to try and make the series competitive?
Don't get on the plane. I mean, he was never. The one thing I probably would have done, and I don't think this gets them even. They might not even want to test here. The one thing I would have done before the series is I probably would have said, well, if I've got Robinson and Broad, I don't need Craig Overton. What I need is another bowler with a bit more pace, who can nip it around a little bit. Saqib Mahmood I've always said was a better option. So, I mean, and the other thing that I would have done, which isn't really a time machine because I said it at the time, but if they were going to play a spinner at Brisbane, the disposable spinner in many ways, sadly, is Dom Bess. And he would have been bowling against the left-handers, which would then have allowed them to bowl Jack Leach at the Adelaide Oval. I don't think it would have worked because the Adelaide Oval has small square boundaries and he was bowling to a bunch of left-handers. But at least he wouldn't have turned up to the Adelaide Oval being unplayable. So those are probably the two main ones. Obviously, I would have picked Broad. I probably would have had Broad and Bess, or Broad or Bess, ahead of Leach for that first test. But there's none of that fixes the problem that they're going up against a really good bowling lineup and they don't have any batters. The only other thing I would have said probably is I think they did, after all that plan. The funny thing is everyone talks about all the planning, but they still basically ended up with Dawid Malan and Hamid in the side, Hasib Hamid in the side, because they played against India, right? I find it very hard to believe that they shouldn't have been opening with a combination of Burns and Sibley, or Burns and Crawley, or Sibley and Crawley, if you want. And so Hamid was a big problem there. And I also think Dawid Malan overperformed. I really don't think he's at this level of cricket. And I think that I probably wouldn't have taken him. I would have had him as my backup batter. He would have come in for someone like Ollie Pope. But there's nothing I have just said that would gets them even close to winning, let alone drawing the series, let alone, being in the series. And that's the truth of where England find themselves compared to Australia at the moment. Perhaps they could have at least won a test and made it slightly more interesting, but I kind of doubt it, if we're being honest. Also, and it is worth saying this, and Australia completely overperformed. Head, Kawaja, Green, Boland, Richardson, all overperformed from what you would imagine you would have got from them in that series. Now, did England play a part in that, Jamie? Yeah, most probably. But I think that, in all honesty, to think that those 5 fringe players were all going to be rolling at that point is unfortunate for your team. So again, that makes me just feel like England had even less chance. I mean, we don't talk about this much, but Cummins missed the test and Hazelwood didn't play that much. And Australia still absolutely smashed England in the face. So yeah, I go back to my original point. They should not have got on that plane. That was a huge error. Cheers for your question, mate. Abraham, last question. Abraham?
Hello.
How you doing? What's your question, mate?
Yeah, hi, Jarrod. Thank you for having me
Hello.
here. So my question was, so recently we have been seeing so many problems with the Duckworth-Lewis. Even when the Windows edition was also released, it was much better, but still, there was some problem. So,
Are you talking about in T20 cricket?
no, I was talking about the Duckworth-Lewis rule.
Yeah, but are you talking about Duckworth-Lewis in T20? I've never seen a Duckworth-Lewis problem in one-day cricket.
Not, yeah. So my question is like, for someone like you who has been a cricket analyst and been working with numbers, what is stopping from developing a better rule to that? Because it has been coming.
What is stopping me?
Yeah. Yes.
You're asking what is stopping me from doing it? Or money?
Yeah.
Time? No, I had a friend who was doing it, Vishal Misra, who invented or co-invented Ball by Ball on Cricinfo. I know he was really interested in it for a long time. Occasionally I get messages from people. It's really not a thing that I care enough about to fix and or have enough time to fix. But yeah, I think there's no doubt in T20 cricket it doesn't work and it's a flawed system. I think in one-day cricket it's okay, but obviously it came in what, 92 or 93, didn't it? I find it hard to believe that we nailed it. And I know it has been updated, obviously, a couple of times since, but it's not a very good predictor of how the game will go if you follow it quite closely. And I think that's what a lot of people who've tried to fix it have noticed. And that there must be a better system that could replace it. But it's not my area of expertise. I completely ignored it as much as humanly possible. And it was always a pain in my ass when I was working for a team and there was rain in the air and we had to start dealing with it. But yeah, it's not something that I would be ever that interested in. But you're right. I mean, I think especially now, we probably haven't quite had an explosion, but with websites out there like Crick Sheets and some of the new stats websites that are coming up, there's more. I want to say passion, but maybe that's the wrong word. But there's more opportunity. There's more people throwing themselves at cricket analytics and cricket data and all these sorts of things. I'd be shocked if one of those people doesn't come out with a better system. The trickier thing is that the ICC has kind of completely invested themselves in Duckworth-Lewis at this point. So it would take a lot, I think, to untangle them from it. But I don't think there's a general manager of the ICC at the moment. I don't know who they're interviewing or talking to for that particular position. But my guess is with a new person in that seat, if they are a little bit more data driven, you could probably twist their arm and say, look, and I it's not like anyone's, if we started it with T20 cricket and see how it went from there, and it's really hard to do it in T20 cricket anyway, but if we started it in T20 cricket and we went from there, I think it would be it would be a good testing ground to see how it works, and then we could move it across to the ODIs if it's a better system altogether. But yeah, there's nothing stopping anyone. I wouldn't have thought that ball by ball data is out there now. We have more information now than we've ever had before, and we know that Duckworth-Lewis stain, or whatever it's called, is flawed, right? I mean, the people who run it don't, would admit that there could be a better system out there, and that that's why they've had to update their system. But yeah, I do believe that something will happen. But probably, I will not be the man to do it. And by probably, I mean definitely, I will not do it.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the answer. Anyways, I'll still suggest you to do it because it will make your name, last till eternity. I feel. Thanks.
Oh, I don't need that. My name's not that pretty. Duckworth, that's a name that you want to last forever. Oh, if you could just hang up on yourself, please. Thank you. I've got one last question, then we're done. Ekanth, you there? Hi, Ekanth.
I thought that was the last question. So the question is about culture. I've read some of this whole stick up and
Mm-hmm.
kind of too much in one lens. Much into so that's the West Indies when restored.
Grovel.
They almost
Yeah.
went. Recently, there was South Africa when the second test. That's what I do. Some this culture affects this.
So it's mostly nonsense, obviously, and it's mostly in hindsight. And also, it doesn't matter if you're the more motivated team if you're nowhere near good enough to win the game. There are certainly games where we see it a lot in Dead Rubbers, where the team who's already lost the series is motivated and the other team isn't. I remember a great one a couple of years ago, and I really upset some cricket people with this, was remember when Colin Graves took over as England chairman, he said something about we expect our team to beat the West Indies because they're an average team. And everyone said, and then West Indies won the second test or the third test, whatever it was. And Darren Sammy, I think it was Darren Sammy, kept going on and on about no, this was in the West Indies. I can't remember. No, it was after 2012. It was 2016 or somewhere around then, because it was after Colin Graves took over the job, or around the time he took over the job. And he, so there was all this talk about this, about how motivated the West Indies were. But the West Indies didn't win the first test. Now, Colin Graves' comments came before the series. And West Indies finally won either the second or the third test to, I can't remember if it was win the series or draw the series. But everything was then attributed back to this motivational comment by Colin Graves and how he'd upset the West Indies. And I kept thinking to myself, if he upset them that much, why didn't they win earlier in the series? Right? Colin Graves didn't say anything more. In fact, I think he'd apologized by the time, things had moved on. Right? It was a really, really silly thing, and I've seen a lot of that. There's absolutely no doubt that you see it in the NBA and baseball sometimes, where one team will just come in and play a normal game because it's just another game for them, and the other team is up because they lost to this team last time, or the star player from the other team made fun of them last time, or whatever. But that's in a really long series. In Test cricket, I think it's very rare for a team not to be up, if that makes sense, unless it's a dead rubber, just because we don't play that much. It's slightly different in IPL and T20 franchise cricket. But again, we don't have as many grudge matches because the season isn't as long and everyone knows each other in cricket, so it's a bit different. West Indies in 1976 did not beat England because Tony Greig said grovel. They beat England because they were far better side, right? And what if he'd said grovel and they'd lost? Would that mean that they weren't motivated? They could have been just as motivated, but not as good. So I think a lot of it is fluff and nonsense. I don't tend to look at it, but I think there are times like, so for instance, the one that comes to mind really, really strongly of recent times is Australia in the 2019 Ashes. I saw Australia partying after that game at, I want to say Edgbaston? No, Old Trafford. I saw them party at Old Trafford, and I left before they started making fun of Jack Leach and all that sort of stuff. But I saw them partying at Old Trafford, and I left that game thinking, I don't think they're going to hit the next game with the same intensity. They're celebrating so much that I just feel like they're going to slip back a little bit here. And I remember a friend of mine, Subash, who sometimes co-hosts the podcast, he was saying, he said, oh, I think you're reading too much into this and everything. And they lost the next game. And ultimately, I've heard the Australian players talk about it since, and they do believe that they didn't go into that game with the right intensity. So it does happen. And you also have things that we don't talk about enough, but schedule losses, right? So if you're, especially in T20 tournaments and World Cups, sometimes you can play a couple of games back to back and another team can be fully rested. So you might have played on a Wednesday and then you're playing on a Friday and the other team hasn't played in a week, right? That means anyone who's a bit banged up is going to struggle in that second game because they haven't had much time to rest, right? And the other team, all their players have had a week to rest. So again, we might assign some of these things to motivation, but I think some of them are, sometimes it's schedule, sometimes it's dead rubberitis. But more often than not, it is impossible to win a game of cricket against another team unless you are playing really good cricket. The whole motivation thing is, I don't want to say it's nonsense, but it's so hard to tell, right? It's one of these things that we focus on again and again and again. And, it might just be that a bunch of people failed against one particular bowler or whatever it could be. If you look at the two biggest test upsets and nearly upsets, the Bangladesh one over New Zealand and the England one against Ireland, I think it's fair to say that in both of those games, those teams went into those games, the favoured teams went into those games not thinking that the other team was going to cause them too much problems. But it's also very fair to say in both of those situations that Ireland bowled brilliantly on day one against England with a guy who was an absolute gun on day one pitches at Lords in their bowling attack, and that Bangladesh all game through performed well above the normal level that you would assume Bangladesh would have. I kept waiting for that particular game for Bangladesh to have the one bad session and New Zealand win the game, which is kind of what happened to Ireland. And so with all that said, yes, motivation plays a part, but it wasn't motivation that made West Indies beat England. And in fact, there's the great Michael Holding thing about that of, there's a lot of talk about how the West Indian team were, if you watch Fire in Babylon, there's this undercurrent of, they were trying to stick it to white people with the way they played. But when you talk to Michael Holding, he'll say, no, we were just as brutal when we played the Asian teams. So again, some of those motivations become assigned later on. I've seen teams that are incredibly motivated that I played for that have gone out and just not played well. And I know they were motivated and I know they were up for the game. And sometimes you see the opposite. And my favorite one is, again, I think I've already quoted Ian O'Brien once, but Ian O'Brien said so many interesting things about sport teams. But he said once that the best team environment he ever played in was a New Zealand team where they kept losing, right? Some of these things, being a close-knit team and being all together and being motivated and all these different things that we talk about, sometimes they just don't translate anyway. And what you try and do is make sure your team is motivated. And what you try and do is fire your team up. I'll tell you, I'll finish this podcast with one story from my time at St. Lucia where we had one particular game where everything went wrong. We were killing Trinidad and Tobago in a game. Darren Bravo, of all people, not even Dwayne Bravo, Darren Bravo came in and played probably one of the best T20 innings that there's ever been. I think they needed somewhere around 15 or 20 runs and over, and they beat us. And it was incredible. And we had back-to-back games. So the next night we had to play again, which was ridiculous to begin with. We'd been in Jamaica playing a game 2 days earlier. We were exhausted. I think we'd played 5 games and some other teams had only played 2. everything was against us in that other game, and I didn't do any analysis. I did my basic level of analysis, but I didn't do my match report analysis from the Trinidad loss because there's nothing for us to learn. We had to throw that game away. And instead, I wrote a letter to Brad Hodge, basically talking about all the things that had gone against us so far in the series. And to be fair, Hodgie sort of took my letter and took the bits he wanted and then added to it as well. And he did this incredibly, I don't know how to put it, but this incredibly eloquent motivational speech, Al Pacino type speech from Any Given Sunday, as much as Brad Hodge can be Al Pacino. And we went out and won that game, right? Now, no one in the world, I've never heard anyone from St. Lucia tell that story other than me, but I felt the energy in the room change from that speech that he gave, and we went out and won the next game. Now, it's also important to note that we lost against Trinidad despite the fact we had dominated them all the way through the game, and Trinidad were the best team in that tournament that year. And the next night, on that back-to-back night, we played against a Barbados team that was falling apart internally and wasn't as good as we were. Did the motivational speech help? Probably. Did it help that we were playing Barbados at home and we'd played really good the night before and now we understood that we could score over 200 runs? More probably, right? I'm not saying Brad Hodges' speech didn't help and that we weren't motivated because I felt it in the room. Also, no, geez, it helped playing a shit team. And I think that we have to be honest with those sorts of things. And that's why it's so hard, right? And that's why I try and steer clear of all that sort of, what's the best way of putting it? Sports babble, right? Because it is, so much of it is just, psycho babble, but it's sports babble in particular, isn't it? So much of it is just absolute bullshit, right? What did West Indies do from 1976 onwards? They dominated everyone. No one had to say the word grovel after that, did they? They just dominated because they were really good at cricket and they were professional for the first time ever, and that helped. So thanks so much for your question, mate. No worries. Thank you to everyone who asked questions today. Back again next week, of course. If you come in halfway through the Spotify Green Room, you can always listen to this back on Red Inca. It'll be up on Saturday morning. And of course, we put them up on YouTube. We don't put, just so everyone knows, we don't put all of them up on YouTube. And the only reason is that at certain times we have so many videos that the green room sometimes get the wagon wheel sometimes gets pushed to the back and they're no longer really fresh. And we'd rather keep them at least within the first few weeks of me doing them. I know most of the questions aren't that topical, but sometimes they are, and we don't want to put up stuff that's out of date. So thank you to everyone who came into the Green Room today to chat to us. Remember, you can subscribe to Jarrod Kimber on Green Room, and you should get alerts when I go live. And big thanks again to the sponsors, Manscaped. If you use the code REDINCA, all one word, you get 20% off on your genital grooming. And who doesn't want 20% off on their genital grooming and free worldwide shipping? And thanks again to the Patreon people who obviously got to ask questions at the start. Remember, you can support us on Patreon. We're working our way. We've had a very good month on Patreon. We're working our way towards a third weekly podcast. But I just need a little bit more money so I can pay guests and also pay my producer Nick and also Muku who chips in on the podcast as well. So if you can support us on Patreon, that would be great. But just thanks for everyone for listening. What have I got? I've got. If you're listening to this live, I've got a couple of really good videos coming up. I've got one about Dean Elgar and South African pitches, and I've got a really interesting one on Ireland's Andy McBride. Well, I know that doesn't sound really interesting. He's not the sexiest player from not the sexiest team, but I think it's a really, really interesting video. So I'll talk to you guys soon, and thank you so much for coming on, asking questions, and all your support. Goodbye.